The night my wife's CEO cornered me at the company gala, he sneered, "From now on, she's mine, and you'll thank me for it." He thought he could buy my silence. He didn't realize he'd just handed me the weapon to destroy them both. The annual gala at the Bellevue Plaza Hotel was meant to be a milestone for my wife, Claire. She'd been preparing for weeks, booking appointments, finalizing details, making sure everything would reflect how far she'd come in her career. From the outside, she looked like a woman at the top of her game, a respected marketing director with a bright future and the admiration of her colleagues. But behind her enthusiasm was something she tried to hide, something I'd been quietly tracking for months. That evening, I played my part. I smiled for photos, shook hands with her coworkers, and pretended not to notice how often Victor Hale, the CEO, drifted into her orbit. Victor was the kind of executive people were careful around. He had a reputation for building companies out of nothing and for leaving anyone who crossed him with even less. He also had a reputation for other things that didn't show up in press releases but were common knowledge if you spent any time in those circles. Claire insisted Victor respected her talent. She said the rumors were just office gossip, jealousy from people who couldn't keep up. Maybe I'd have believed her if I hadn't already noticed the late-night texts she tried to delete or the sudden business trips that always seemed to happen when Victor traveled. Maybe I'd have ignored the way she flinched when I asked simple questions. But by then, my instincts had been telling me the truth she wouldn't admit. I'd considered confronting her outright, but part of me still hoped I was wrong. Another part needed evidence. You can't rebuild your life on suspicion. You need facts, even if they hurt. So I waited. I watched. The gala was my opportunity to see them together outside the office where they'd feel untouchable. As guests arrived, I stayed near the entrance, watching how Claire's posture shifted when Victor entered, how her shoulders straightened, how her expression changed. It wasn't affection she felt for him. It was something closer to submission or fear. I wasn't sure which would be worse. Victor made his rounds with practiced charm, greeting executives, thanking investors, always smiling. But every time his gaze landed on Claire, it lingered a fraction too long. She tried to pretend not to notice. I tried to pretend I didn't see it. But I was cataloging every glance, every twitch of her hands. Later, as the crowd thinned near the bar, I moved closer to listen. Claire was talking to a colleague, but she kept scanning the room. Her eyes found Victor across the floor, and something silent passed between them. He nodded, barely perceptible. She set down her glass, murmured an excuse, and slipped away toward the back hallway. Victor waited only a moment before following her. I counted to 10, then walked after them, my heartbeat steady and cold. It was one of those moments when you already know the truth, but you need to hear it anyway. I passed the restrooms and found the private lounge door just closing. I moved closer until I could hear them. Victor's voice was smooth, low. "I'm done pretending, Claire. When are you going to tell him?" Her answer was so quiet I had to strain to catch it. "He doesn't deserve this." Victor gave a short laugh. "That's not an answer." "I need time," she whispered. "He's never going to be anything more than a liability. You're wasting your life propping him up. Let me take care of it." I pressed my palm flat against the door, willing myself not to walk in and end it right then. But emotion is a trap. I needed leverage, not an outburst. So I kept listening. Claire sounded near tears. "He's not as weak as you think." "He doesn't matter," Victor said, his tone turning dismissive. "And when this is over, he'll have nothing." A quiet shuffling followed. The door clicked open, and I slipped back around the corner, out of sight. When they emerged, Claire's eyes were downcast. Victor looked satisfied. In that moment, I knew there was no misunderstanding left. She was gone already, she just hadn't found the nerve to tell me. I went back to the bar and ordered a whiskey I didn't touch. My hands were steady. My breathing even. Because something had shifted inside me. They thought they had all the power. They believed I'd just fade into the background while they planned my erasure. But they'd misjudged me. Later, as the final speeches wrapped up and the music died down, Victor approached me with the expression of a man certain of his victory. He waited until Claire had stepped away to talk to a colleague, then clapped a hand on my shoulder like we were old friends. "Ethan, right?" His voice was warm, false. "I've been meaning to thank you. You've been very supportive of Claire's career." I met his eyes, saying nothing. "You'll want to keep that up," he continued, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "From now on, she's under my guidance. If you're smart, you'll be grateful. If you're not, well, I can make sure you regret it." He gave my shoulder a final squeeze before walking away, certain he'd delivered the final blow. But all he'd done was confirm every suspicion and give me the motive I needed. That night, while Claire slept a foot away, I lay awake, staring into the darkness, and realized the choice was simple. Either accept their plan or dismantle it piece by piece. I chose the latter. By dawn I had a plan. If Victor believed I was just an obstacle to be swept aside, he'd made a critical error. He underestimated how far I'd go to protect what I had left of my life and my dignity. And he'd underestimated how well I knew how to find the soft spots under a polished image. While Claire still slept, I got out of bed and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I began listing every contact I'd kept over the years, old clients, acquaintances, the handful of friends who'd landed in finance and investigative journalism. Some of them owed me favors. Others simply enjoyed the chance to expose someone they resented. I didn't care about their reasons, only their results. The first call went to Greg, a forensic accountant I'd met years before when he'd audited a company I consulted for. He picked up after 2 rings, sounding surprised to hear from me so early. I told him I was looking for background on Victor Hale. His tone shifted instantly, turning cautious. "You know what you're asking me to do?" he said. "Yes," I replied. "I'm not afraid of a fight." He was quiet a moment before he said, "All right. I'll see what I can find." Next, I called Mark, a reporter who specialized in corporate misconduct. He'd always believed that powerful executives hid rot under their polished veneers. I didn't need to convince him Victor was worth looking into. All I had to do was promise documentation. By mid-morning, I'd set in motion 2 investigations, one financial, one personal. All I had to do was wait. While the information came together, I turned my focus to Claire. If she was planning to leave me, she'd be preparing for it in subtle ways, moving money, lining up legal advice, rewriting her story to paint herself as the victim. I needed to know every step, so I bought a tracking app and quietly installed it on her phone while she showered. It was disturbingly easy to set up. Within minutes, I had access to her location and message logs. That afternoon, while she was at work, I slipped into her car and placed a small recording device under the passenger seat. It activated automatically whenever she started the engine, capturing every conversation she had inside. She'd think she was safe in her own vehicle. She'd be wrong. In the evenings, I pretended nothing had changed. I asked about her day. I listened to her stories about work. I nodded in the right places, studying every word for inconsistencies. The lies were smoother now, more practiced, but they were still lies. After she fell asleep, I reviewed the files coming in from Greg and Mark. They worked faster than I expected. Within 3 days, Greg sent me a summary of Victor's offshore holdings. Dozens of shell companies, hidden accounts under other names, money routed through tax havens. Some of it was clearly illegal, and all of it would be explosive if exposed. Mark uncovered something else, a non-disclosure agreement between Victor and a former employee. The settlement was large enough to bury any scandal, sexual harassment, maybe worse. He'd paid to make it vanish, but the paper trail remained. One of Mark's sources confirmed Victor's private behavior was even uglier than rumors suggested. He'd leveraged his position to manipulate employees for years. I saved every file, every transcript, every email. Alone in the kitchen, I felt no satisfaction. Just a cold certainty that this was the only way forward. Each evening, Claire's phone fed me her private messages. Most were mundane, work updates, logistics. But then came a string of texts that made my stomach clench. "Victor, when are you telling him?" "Claire, soon." "Victor, he deserves to hear it from you. But if you can't, I will." "Claire, please. Just a little more time." "Victor, you're not backing out, are you?" There it was, in her own words. Confirmation that everything I'd suspected was real. Over the next few days, she became more tense. She started locking her phone. She hesitated before answering my questions. But she still hadn't guessed I knew everything. That was my advantage. She believed I was too naive to suspect, too weak to act. Meanwhile, Mark prepared a story. Greg expanded his report into a dossier thick enough to ruin Victor's career. All I needed was the right moment to release it. Then an opportunity appeared sooner than I'd hoped. Victor's company announced an investor showcase the following Friday. It was a critical event. He planned to unveil a new acquisition strategy and reassure stakeholders. Any sign of scandal could devastate confidence and sink the share price overnight. I knew that would be the perfect stage. If Victor wanted to humiliate me and discard me as irrelevant, he'd have to watch me dismantle everything he'd built. And Claire would have no illusions about the man she'd betrayed me for. One evening as she prepared for bed, she turned to me as if searching my face for something. "Ethan," she said cautiously, "you've been distant. Is everything okay?" I looked at her and wondered how many ways I could answer. That everything was falling apart? That she'd torn the foundation of our marriage to shreds? That I'd already set in motion a plan she couldn't escape? Instead, I smiled faintly. "Just work stress." She looked relieved. "I'm sorry. I know I've been distracted lately." I didn't reply. She didn't expect me to. She kissed my cheek and turned away, confident she still controlled the narrative. As she drifted off to sleep, I watched the rise and fall of her breathing and felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just resolve. Victor believed he held all the leverage. Claire believed she could pretend until it was convenient to confess. They were both wrong. The night of the showcase would be the end of their story together and the start of mine without them. The morning of the investor showcase dawned bright and unremarkable. Claire was already up, packing her work bag and reviewing notes. She looked every bit the competent professional she wanted the world to see. But I knew that by nightfall, nothing about her life would look the same. I went through my own routine without revealing any sign of what I had planned. In the kitchen, I checked my phone. Mark had confirmed his article was scheduled for publication at 7:30 p.m., just as Victor would be taking the stage to deliver his keynote. Greg had sent the finalized financial report complete with copies of offshore wire transfers, fraudulent invoices, and a signed settlement agreement from the former employee Victor had paid off. All the evidence was neatly cataloged and ready for distribution to the board of directors, the press, and the investors attending in person. It would hit all at once, giving Victor no chance to spin it. Claire walked past me on her way out the door, pausing for a moment. "I'll see you tonight?" I nodded, careful to keep my expression neutral. "Of course." She seemed relieved. That was what she wanted most, my cooperation, my ignorance. She needed me to stay predictable until she was ready to discard me. But she was the one walking blind. After she left, I took a moment to breathe. I wasn't nervous. I'd spent too many nights rehearsing exactly how this would go. I emailed the files to a secure backup. I triple-checked the schedule with Mark. I prepared a second set of messages for Claire, screenshots of her conversations with Victor, including the ones where she described me as pathetic and a burden. Those would be delivered the moment the story went live. At 6, I dressed and headed to the venue. The Bellevue Conference Center was already filling with investors and reporters. I kept to the edges of the room, scanning the crowd. Victor stood near the stage, greeting people with the same calculated warmth I'd seen at the gala. He looked untouchable, exactly as he wanted to appear. Claire appeared a few minutes later. She was tense, her eyes flicking around the room. When she spotted me, she forced a small smile. I nodded politely, giving her no reason to suspect that I'd spent the past week preparing to dismantle the life she'd chosen over ours. By 7:15, the seats were full. Victor took the stage, his voice calm as he began outlining the company's vision for the next decade. The audience watched with polite interest. His tone never wavered. He was certain of his control. At 7:28, I opened my phone and tapped send. In that instant, Mark's exposé went live on every major business outlet's website. Greg's report was delivered by email to the board, key investors, and the SEC. My messages to Claire were dispatched to her private inbox. Everything I'd been gathering for weeks landed at once. It took less than 2 minutes for the reaction to ripple through the room. Phones buzzed, screens lit up. A senior executive near the front scrolled through his tablet, his face turning pale. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. The noise level began to rise, voices overlapping, questions surfacing. Victor kept speaking, oblivious at first. Then he noticed the shift, the restless energy moving through the crowd. He hesitated mid-sentence. Someone stood up, holding out a phone. Another voice called, "Victor, is this true?" He glanced at the board members seated along the aisle. A few were already rising, their expressions hard. One of them signaled security. The murmur grew into a low roar as more attendees opened the news alert. Victor tried to speak over it. "Everyone, please, there's been some mistake." No one listened. The headline was too clear: CEO Victor Hale accused of fraud and misconduct, evidence leaked by whistleblower. Across the room, Claire was frozen, phone clutched in her hand. I watched her thumb scroll through the messages I'd sent. Every lie, every secret, every betrayal laid out in undeniable detail. Her eyes lifted to mine, wide with panic. I felt nothing, no pity, no satisfaction. Just completion. Victor's voice rose in desperation. "We'll address these allegations, I assure you." But the board members were already conferring in hushed tones, some stepping away to call legal counsel. An investor shouted, "This is the second time you've lied to us. You're finished." Security approached the stage. Victor looked stunned. He turned to Claire, seeking reassurance, but she didn't move. She looked as cornered as he was. Finally, he spotted me. Our eyes locked. He understood exactly who had done this. His expression twisted with fury. But it was too late. He could blame me all he wanted, but he'd given me the tools to bring him down the moment he decided to threaten me in that ballroom. I left my seat and walked toward the exit as the chaos escalated. Investors argued, reporters snapped photos, board members organized an emergency session to suspend Victor's authority. As I passed Claire, she reached for my arm. "Ethan, wait, please." I looked at her hand, then at her face. "Check your email," I said. She didn't reply. She knew what she'd find there. When I stepped into the night air, the noise from inside faded behind me. For the first time in months, the knot in my chest loosened. I hadn't needed to shout or threaten. I hadn't needed to degrade myself to their level. All it took was showing the truth to the people who mattered. Inside the building, Victor Hale's career was collapsing in real time. Claire's illusions were dissolving with it. They'd built a story where I was disposable, a supporting character in their little drama. But I'd written the ending, and I was ready to begin whatever came next. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I checked into a small business hotel across town. I didn't want to risk Claire showing up at the house, trying to talk her way out of what she'd done. I needed distance while everything unraveled. The next morning, I woke to dozens of messages. Mark had sent me links to the coverage. Every major outlet had picked up the story, and Victor's face was everywhere, headlines outlining his fraud, the settlement with his former employee, the offshore accounts. Investors were pulling out. The company's stock had fallen by almost 40% overnight. Greg texted to confirm the SEC had launched an investigation. He sounded almost surprised by how fast it had escalated. I wasn't. I'd made sure there was no ambiguity in the evidence. By noon, a formal statement was released by the company's board of directors. Victor had been suspended pending a full internal review. An interim CEO was appointed. They were eager to distance themselves from the scandal. The statement included a promise to cooperate with authorities. Victor hadn't been arrested yet, but everyone knew it was coming. The money he'd moved offshore wasn't hidden well enough to survive a real audit. I spent the day following updates from my hotel room. Occasionally, I checked my personal email. Claire sent messages that grew increasingly frantic. "Ethan, please talk to me. You don't understand everything. We can fix this. I never meant for you to get hurt. Please, just call me." I didn't reply. She hadn't cared if I got hurt when she was planning my replacement. Her concern only surfaced once her own security was at risk. By late afternoon, I received a notification that she'd been escorted out of the company offices. Human Resources had terminated her contract. She wasn't named in the official statements, but everyone knew she'd been involved with Victor. There was no version of this where she kept her position. That evening, I went home. The house was dark. Claire's car was gone. I assumed she was at her sister's or maybe a hotel of her own. It didn't matter. There was nothing left to discuss. I walked through each room, feeling the tension that had weighed on me for so long finally begin to lift. The evidence of her double life was everywhere, her laptop on the coffee table, folders marked confidential, the perfume she'd started wearing because Victor liked it. It all felt as if it belonged to someone I'd never really known. I gathered the papers I needed for my attorney. The divorce process wouldn't take long. California was clear about community property, and I'd already arranged to prove she'd used marital funds to support the affair. My attorney assured me the courts wouldn't look kindly on her actions. That night, Claire called. The phone rang until it stopped, then rang again. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't want to hear excuses or apologies. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. When I woke the next morning, there was a single text. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to end like this." I deleted it without replying. Over the next few days, the fallout continued. Victor tried to issue statements through his lawyer, claiming the allegations were exaggerated. But the documents spoke for themselves. Investors began filing civil suits. The company's legal team prepared to cooperate with federal investigators. A week later, the news reported that Victor had been formally charged with wire fraud and falsifying financial statements. The story included footage of him leaving his attorney's office, surrounded by reporters shouting questions he refused to answer. I watched it alone, feeling no triumph. I hadn't done any of this to feel powerful. I'd done it because it was the only way to stop them from taking everything I'd worked for and pretending it was theirs by right. The day after Victor's arrest, I met with my divorce attorney. She reviewed the file I'd put together, Claire's messages, the financial records, the documentation of her role in covering Victor's misconduct. "This is more than enough," she said calmly. "You'll have the advantage in negotiations." I nodded. "I'm not trying to destroy her. I just want this over." "You'll get a fair settlement," she assured me. "Her reputation is already gone." When I left her office, I didn't feel relief so much as a hollow sort of clarity. Everything that had held my life together, the job stability, the marriage, the future I thought we shared, was gone. But the truth was it had been gone long before the showcase. All I'd done was bring it into daylight. A week later, I received the official notice that the company had permanently terminated Claire's employment. No references. No severance. Her professional standing evaporated in an instant. She tried again to reach me, one more email, more pleas for a conversation. I didn't answer. There was no version of a conversation that would change what she'd done or why she'd done it. Some nights, I lay awake thinking of how easily it had all begun, her telling herself it was harmless, that she deserved better. Victor convincing her she owed him loyalty over me. But it wasn't my job to understand or forgive it. It was my job to protect what I could from the wreckage. I spent the next days finalizing paperwork, closing shared accounts, removing her access to my credit. It felt methodical, almost impersonal. That was the only way to do it without second-guessing. When everything was signed and filed, I locked the last stack of documents in my desk drawer and stood in the living room, listening to the quiet. The house felt different without the tension, without the pretending. It didn't feel like home yet, but it felt like mine again. Victor had believed he was invincible. Claire had believed she could rewrite the truth when it suited her. Neither of them had thought I would ever act. But in the end, they'd built the weapons I'd use to bring them down. As I closed the door and turned off the lights, I knew it was nearly over. All that remained was to finish the divorce and step into the life they'd tried to take from me. 2 months later, the divorce was finalized. I sat across from Claire in a small conference room as our attorneys flipped through the last pages of the settlement agreement. She looked tired. Her hands fidgeted in her lap and she kept her eyes down. She didn't try to speak to me that day. Maybe she understood there was nothing left to say. Or maybe she knew any words would only confirm that the life we'd built was beyond repair. My lawyer handed me a pen. I signed my name where she indicated. Claire did the same, her hand trembling just enough to be noticeable. When it was over, the attorneys stood to exchange pleasantries and finalize copies. I didn't wait around. I got up, nodded politely, and walked out without looking back. By then, the consequences of their choices were fully in motion. Victor had been indicted on multiple counts of fraud. He'd posted bail but was prohibited from contacting any company personnel or setting foot in the building he once controlled. The Department of Justice released a statement confirming the investigation would expand to include additional financial misconduct. His face appeared on evening news broadcasts almost every day, always under the same headline, "Disgraced CEO faces federal charges." His attorneys tried to blame a rogue accountant for the falsified records. But the emails Greg recovered proved Victor had personally ordered the transfers and concealed the payments. The more he fought the charges, the more evidence surfaced. Meanwhile, Claire moved into a small rental across town. She filed to have her last name legally restored. Friends we once shared stopped calling her. Word of her involvement had spread further than she expected. She tried to rebuild her professional network, but no reputable company would touch her resume. Her previous employer had made it clear she was terminated for cause, and in her field, reputation was currency. I'd retained nearly everything in the settlement, the house, the bulk of our savings, and the vehicles. She walked away with a portion of her retirement fund and little else. My attorney told me it was the most favorable outcome I could have hoped for under state law. In the weeks after the divorce, she sent a few more messages. They were short and subdued, like she'd finally run out of ways to justify what she'd done. "I'm sorry. I wish I could undo everything. I hope someday you can forgive me." I never answered. There was no point. Forgiveness wasn't owed just because she regretted the outcome. She hadn't regretted the betrayal, only the exposure. On the day Victor's trial date was announced, Mark called to thank me. His story had earned him an award for investigative reporting. He asked if I wanted to be quoted by name as the whistleblower. No, I told him. I'm not interested in being part of it anymore. That was the truth. I hadn't done any of this for recognition. I'd done it to make sure I wasn't erased, to prove to myself that I wasn't as powerless as Victor believed. In the evenings, I settled into a new routine. I went back to consulting work, slowly rebuilding the professional relationships that mattered. I reconnected with a few old friends, the kind who hadn't disappeared when things got difficult. Some nights, I thought about what might have happened if I'd ignored my instincts. If I'd accepted Claire's lies and let Victor treat me like an inconvenience. But in the end, they'd forced me to make a choice. And I chose to fight. I'd learned something important in the process. When people show you exactly who they are, it's a mistake to pretend otherwise. Claire had chosen ambition over honesty. Victor had chosen power over decency. And when they failed to get what they wanted, they turned on each other almost as quickly as they turned on me. The final divorce decree arrived by mail one afternoon. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and locked it away. There was nothing left to grieve. The marriage had ended long before the paperwork made it official. Victor's trial began 3 months after the showcase. The coverage was relentless. He looked smaller in the photos, no longer the confident executive who tried to threaten me into silence. His attorney issued a statement claiming he was misunderstood, but the evidence spoke for itself. When the verdict was announced, I didn't feel vindicated so much as finished. He was convicted on all counts. The company he'd built was sold off in parts to cover legal fees and restitution. Claire's involvement wasn't criminal, but her reputation was beyond repair. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Justice had already been served the moment the truth came out. One evening, I stood in the kitchen of the house I kept, the place they'd tried to take from me. It felt quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Peaceful. I knew rebuilding would take time. I knew trust wouldn't come easily again. But I also knew that the hardest part was over. Victor had once told me I'd be left with nothing. He'd said I'd thank him for taking what was mine. But as I looked around the life he failed to destroy, I realized he'd never understood me at all. I didn't need to win by his rules. I just needed to survive them and hold onto my integrity while he lost his. When it was all over, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like someone who'd reclaimed his life on his own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I was certain of who I was and what I deserved.